Another clever way to adjust for a larger bust is by adjusting the placement of the armholes in a yoke sweater. So there's no rule that says you have to have the same number of stitches in the front and the back. What you can do is remove some of the stitches from the back, add them to the front, and move the placement of those sleeves further to the back, giving you more fabric in the front where you need it. Hey Nerdy Knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and the goal here at Nerdy Knitting is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. And when you learn to customize a sweater to fit you perfectly, you'll feel pretty confident. Now, this video is specifically about the different ways to add extra shaping for the bust specifically. But this is actually the third video in a three-part series where we've dived deep into this topic about choosing the right size to knit and how to make other modifications as well. We're going to focus solely on the different ways, because there are more than like just the vertical bust darts and the short row bust darts that you can use to add extra fabric for your bust. But before you do that, you need to make sure you know how to pick the right size for you. And that is something we explored in the first video in this series, where if you are larger busted, you don't want to use your full bust measurement to figure out what size to knit. You actually want to use your upper bust measurement and then make adjustments for your full bust. That way the sweater will fit you through the shoulders and the neckline much better. If you chose a size based on your full bust and your full bust is quite a bit larger than that upper bust, then this part of your sweater is going to be too large. Now, we dive deep into that topic in another video, so I'm going to link that down below. After you watch this, you can go back and make sure that you've got the right size chosen before you make these bust adjustments. And the second video in this series focused on other ways to make customizations, shortening and lengthening the body and the sleeves, adding waist shaping, short rows for the back neck, different things like that to really make a sweater fit well. So I'll link that one as well, and we'll dive into that in that video. But this one is going to focus specifically on 9 different ways that you can add extra fabric where you need it in your bust. Now, we're talking about the bust in this one, but this can also work if you have a larger stomach as well. Some of these ideas, not all of them, but some of them will work. You just would move the placement over your stomach instead of over your bust. So if you have somebody has, like your husband has a little pot belly or something like that, you can use some of these methods, like short row bust darts actually, but place them over the stomach instead to give a little extra fabric where it's needed. But for women, that's usually the bust. Now, when we talk about knitting patterns, the average is a B cup size. That's what the sizes are based on. That is assuming that the upper bust, when you measure just at the underarm all the way around, and the full bust has about a 2-inch difference. So that's the average, the B cup. That is what knitting patterns are based on. So I'm guessing a lot of women are not B cups. Many of them are larger, some are smaller. But for those of us who are larger, we have to make some adjustments to make that sweater fit, because we still want to choose a size that will fit us in our shoulders and neckline, but then we have to make some sort of customizations and accommodations for larger busts or even larger stomachs. So we have these 9 methods that we're going to look at, and I've placed them sort of roughly in the order of easiest to most difficult. None of them are super hard. Short row bust darts can feel a little confusing when you first do them, but after you've done them a time or two, it really does get much easier to just sort of make this calculation every time you want to knit a sweater for yourself. I promise, it's not that hard. There is some math involved, but it's really pretty simple. And I don't want you to pigeonhole yourself. Like if you've always done short row bust darts, give some of these other methods a try as well, because depending on what you're knitting, if you're knitting a plain stockinette sweater, then it's easy to do any adjustment. But sometimes when you've got stitch patterns or color work or other things going on in the garment, you can pick and choose among these different methods, or even combine a few to really customize the fit and still get that beautiful design on the sweater as well. And this also works if you have a very large bust. Generally short row bust darts, you don't want to do more than maybe 3 inches of them, because then it gets to be a little too much and too noticeable on the front of the sweater. But then if you need to add more room for your bust beyond that 3 inches of short row shaping, then you can combine it with another method as well. There's nothing that says you have to just use one. You can combine methods to get the fit that you need. So we'll start with sweaters worked in pieces, and there are a few things you can do if you're knitting sweater in pieces. You're knitting the front and the back and the sleeves and then sewing them up. There's a couple things you can do. The first thing you can do is to actually knit a larger size just for the front, because when we're talking bust shaping, if you measure around the fullest point of your bust, so you know that measurement, And then you measure from like your side seam all the way around your back to the other side seam, just along the back, and subtract that from the full bust. That will tell you the difference, how much extra fabric you need in the front compared to the back. And this is going to work for lots of different sweaters. You'll want to know the difference. Let's say you're 40 inches all the way around, but you're just, let's say 15 inches along the back from one underarm to the other underarm. So that means you have 5 extra inches in the front compared to the back. So when you're knitting flat and you're picking out the size for your sweater, you can pick out a base size that will fit the back from that underarm to the underarm, and then choose one size larger perhaps, or look at the finished measurements for the garment to decide, and choose a size that is larger or wider across the front. Like in that example, we've got that extra 5 inches. Choose a size that will give you 5 extra inches in the front and not so much in the back. Because one thing I see a lot of women do is they look at their full bust and they knit a garment based on that, and then they end up with all this extra fabric in the back. We don't need the fabric in the back. Your back is probably pretty straight and flat. You need the extra fabric in the front. So making accommodations like this, like knitting 2 different sizes, puts that fabric where you need it to be. Now the only thing to keep in mind here is you want to knit the same number of rows, because you want the front and the back to be the same length. And what often happens with the different sizes are going to have you knitting like different measurement, like it's going to say knit so many inches to the underarm. And different sizes will have a different number of inches. So the only thing you want to calculate or make sure you're paying attention to is that you're choosing the same number of inches for both the front and the back, even though you'll have more stitches across the front. Now this is a great way to add extra fabric exactly where you need it, just across the front of the sweater. Now that's a great way to add quite a bit of extra fabric, but if you just have to add a little bit, another thing you can do when you're knitting in pieces is by changing the needle size just across the bust. And this is something I've actually done myself. And you'll want to make sure that you have swatched with different needle sizes. If you've ever watched my swatching video, I like to swatch using 3 different needle sizes in the same swatch, so I don't have to go back and redo my swatching. I can check all these 3 different sizes and see which needle size gives me the best fabric. And I can also use it for this step if I want to just go up a needle size just across the bust to add a little bit more ease in that area. You're not like making a whole new size, you're just going to be adding like your stitch gauge is going to be slightly larger. You're going to have more stitches or fewer stitches to the inch, but they're just larger stitches because you're going up a needle size, and that gives you a little more space through the bust. Now this is sort of like, you can just try it out and see. You could work on your sweater up to the bust, go up a needle size just for the bust, and then go back down a needle size. But it is good to swatch it and see what the difference is in the fabric. Most of the time it's not very noticeable that you've changed needle size in that area. So if you just have to make a small adjustment, you just want to add a little bit more ease to that area, then you can go up this needle size. And if you want to be very exact, check your gauge on your swatch to see how much extra fabric or extra ease that's going to give you through the bust. Now the third thing you can do for adding extra room for your bust is specifically for top-down sweaters. You can add extra stitches when you're casting on at the underarm. So if you've ever knit a top-down sweater, either a yoke sweater or a raglan sweater, then you have knit the top of the sweater, and that's got your sleeves, your neckline, your front and your back all joined together. And then you get to the point where you need to divide for the sleeves, and you usually slip some stitches over to save for your sleeve for later on. You cast on some stitches at the underarm, you knit across the front, you put some stitches on hold for the other sleeve, you cast on some more stitches for that underarm, and then you knit across the back. More or less, that's how it works. Now, where you're casting on, your pattern will tell you how many stitches that you need to cast on. But you can actually cast on more stitches right there, and that will give you more fabric just where you're going to need it, just when you're going to be starting your bust shaping. So the general rule is that you can add about 2 inches to each side. So you could add up to 4 inches total for extra room through the bust. So this is a good way to do that as well. If you're working a yoke sweater and you've already finished all the color work and now you're just straight home stockinette like you're just going to be knitting, you can add those 2 inches at each side to give you some extra space. Now you'll have to pay attention though, because whatever stitches you're adding at the underarm, you also have to add to the sleeve. When you come back later, you have to pick up sleeve stitches, and you have to pick up stitches along that cast on edge where you've cast on those stitches. So you're going to have to pay attention, because you might not want to have those 2 extra inches in your sleeve. So you can sort of you'll have to adjust. This is sort of a play it by ear to see how you can pick up and make it look seamless, but then get rid of those stitches so you don't have that extra fabric, or perhaps you want that extra fabric in your arm, and then it's okay. But you'll have to work out how you're going to shape the sleeve as well. So there is that to consider, but it's not a difficult thing to do. And we do discuss that, changing the sleeve, the shaping rate on a sleeve in our other video. So you'll want to make sure you watch that one. But this is a good way to add up to 4 inches to the bust and get extra room just where you need it. Now the fourth thing you can do is use an underarm gusset. Now this is specifically for sweaters that are knit bottom up in the round. If you've ever seen a fisherman's gansey or knit one yourself, all those textured patterns on there, you'll often see an underarm gusset. It's like a little wedge of fabric, little triangular shaped wedge that's added at the underarm. It's generally added to add more ease of movement for the sleeve, and which is something that in a fisherman's sweater they would really need that. But that can also serve a second purpose. It can add some extra fabric through the garment itself. Now a lot of patterns aren't going to include something like this, but I actually did knit one that included this, and I thought it was a great feature. The Kelda tee by Slade. It's a bottom up knit in the round, just a cute little summer top, but it includes a little gusset at the underarm where you're increasing and adding this little wedge of fabric right there, and that gives you some extra stitches across in that underarm bust area. So it's another way to add a few inches of bust fabric or underarm. I mean, it's still at the underarm, but it's adding extra fabric where you need it as well. Now next is a raglan sweater. I know if you've knit one, then you probably understand how they work. You cast on if you're knitting top down, and you have 8 increases. You have 2 for the body right here, and then the 2 for the sleeves, and then the same on the back. 2 for the sleeves, 2 for the back. So 8 increases altogether, and it might have a different rate, might be every other round or something like that. But you know, there is no rule that says you have to keep doing the same increased rate. You can add and subtract increases for the sleeves. You can add and subtract increases for the back. You can add and subtract increases for the front. So if the rest of the sweater is fitting well, you've chosen a size that's going to fit you here, what you can do is add increases just along that front line, just for the front of the garment. Now you might want to test and swatch to see which increases will be most invisible, because it could be noticeable, especially if you're using something like yarn overs, that suddenly you have extra yarn overs right there but not on the sleeve increase side, and it can be more noticeable. So this is where you do want to test and make sure you're choosing an increase that is more invisible, so you can add extra increases just to the front where you need that fabric, and you don't have to add any extra ones to the back because you don't need them on the back, you just need them on the front. So you can change that increase rate along those raglan lines to get some extra fabric. So for example, when we talk about combining, this is a good way to combine. You can combine some of those increases along your raglan line, and then when you switch to separate for the sleeves and the body, you can cast on some stitches under both underarms, and then combine those 2 methods to really get the extra fabric for your bust. Now, if you're knitting your raglan sweater in the round from the bottom up, then you could either cast on all the stitches you need for your full bust, and then when you get to that underarm and raglan line, you're going to decrease all those extra stitches out along that raglan line. Or if you want to have it more shaped, you could have it more fitted at the bottom and then use vertical bust darts, which we're going to get to add extra fabric just before the bust, and then still do the same thing. You would decrease those stitches out along the raglan lines. And you can do the same sort of thing with yoke sweaters as well. But the difference with yoke sweaters is the placement of the increases. If you're knitting a top-down sweater, your raglan has those raglan shaping lines where you have the 8 increases. But when you're working a yoke sweater, you can have those increases are spaced in different ways. The very common method is to have 3 increase rounds where you increase a whole bunch of stitches once, you work a few rows plain, and then you increase another whole round of stitches again, work some more plain rounds, and then do another increase round before you divide for the body and the sleeves. Then that gets you to your full stitch count. But that's not the only way to add stitches to a yoke sweater. Adding different shaping wedges where you've got the increases. In this example, they're worked right at the top, and then some more are worked within the motif. And then in a colorwork sweater, you can actually work those increases right into your design in the background area of your stitches as well. So you want to look at that top-down yoke pattern specifically to see where you want to add those extra stitches. This also works for bottom up as well. You'd have to decide on the placement for those decreases. You would knit your sweater at a larger size for the bust, and then you would add extra decreases to get to a smaller size through the upper bust and the shoulders and neckline. But using like the placement of the initial increases or decreases to get you started. Is it one where you have those 3 rounds? Then you could just throw in an extra round of increases or decreases to get to that stitch count you need, but only do them across the front where you need the fabric. You don't have to do it all the way around. It can just be in the front. Or if it has like all over patterning or texture, how are the increases or decreases placed in there, and can you find places to add some more? This is like, you have to, because of the pattern, it will vary from sweater to sweater. So you'll have to like sit down and look at that pattern specifically and see where you can place those extra stitches. And this is another place where you can also combine different methods. You could add some extra stitches within the yoke, and then you could also add some extra stitches when you cast on those stitches at the underarm. And like our raglan example, if you're knitting from the bottom up in the round, then you could either start with the full circumference that you need for your bust, or if you wanted a little snugger at the hips, you could knit it at a smaller size and then use vertical bust darts to get the bust shaping and then decrease away within the yoke of the sweater. Another clever thing you can do with a yoke sweater is actually move the placement of the sleeves itself. When we go back to talking about like when we choose a sweater based on our full bust, I find this most noticeable in sort of a yoke sweater where we knit the whole top part of the sweater, and then we put it on and there's all this extra fabric in the back. Because we used our full bust measurement, but that extra fabric that we need it all in the front where our full bust is. We don't need it across the back. So this is one of those instances where I really love this idea of we move our sleeves back instead. Depending on the patterning, you might have to make adjustments, especially if it's an all over pattern. But this is easier to do if like there's a pattern on the top and then it's done when you divide for the sleeves and the body. And then everything else is just in stockinette stitch. What you can do is take some of those stitches from the back and basically move them to the front. Like say you take 5 stitches from the back on each side and they go to the front, and that means you're just taking your sleeve stitches and moving them back by 5 stitches on each side, or whatever your number of stitches is. So you're just sort of like subtracting some stitches from the front and adding them, or subtracting them from the back, adding them to the front by moving the sleeves back a little bit. And that just moves that fabric. Like you still have all the fabric you need, but you're just putting it where you need it in the front and removing it from the back. So this is actually a really not difficult thing to do. You just have to look at your pattern and make a note of what you've done so you know that there's more stitches sort of in the front. I mean, you're going to be just knitting in the round anyway, but because you've put the sleeves, you've moved them back, you've given yourself more fabric along the front. Now we're moving into bust darts, and we're going to start with vertical bust darts first. This is where you add some shaping. A lot of times it's done along the underarms, but I'm talking about when you place it right in the body of the sweater where you need it. And it can be used for other things as well. I like to use this for waist shaping. If I have cast on like a larger size for the front, I might use this to decrease some stitches away from the back, because then the back looks more fitted and the sweater doesn't look too big and baggy. Like I still have the extra fabric where I want it in the front, but I've taken some out in the back so it looks just a little more fitted. Now you would use this with sweaters that either are like form-fitting or have some negative ease. If you're wearing a sweater like I am with so much positive ease, you don't have to add any sort of extra shaping anywhere. There's just no need for it because the sweater body is already so large. But when the sweater is really going to be fitted to your body and your bust is larger, then it might just be way too fitted in the bust. You've got to add some sort of shaping right there. So that's where vertical bust darts can come in handy. Now, this is also for waist shaping, like I said, and I'm going to link to an Amy Herzog article where she talks more about this. But like if you're going to work them across your back, you would just divide your stitches into thirds and place a marker between those thirds, and that's where you'd work your increases or decreases. Along the front, you don't want them placed over the apex of your bust because it just looks very awkward. So what you would do is take about half your stitches, and that would be what stitches are in the center. You'd have a marker on each side, and that would give you about a quarter of each, the stitch count on each side. So you're going to work your increases and decreases where that marker is placed, probably on the outside of it. So if you're working bottom up, let's say you've cast on more stitches at your hips and you want to have a bit of waist shaping, so you're going to work some decreases at those markers till you get to your waist. Work a few plain rounds, and then you'll probably want to start increasing for your bust. So you would work some increases at those markers to get up to a larger stitch count for your bust. So depending on how much space you have between your waist and your bust will change how many stitches you can add here and how quickly. Because if you have a very short waist and a very large bust, you don't have many rows to work with. But what you could actually do is along that marker, work an increase before, work an increase after on one side, and then do the same with the other marker. So you're actually increasing 4 stitches. And I mean, depending on your gauge, that can be quite a few inches that you can add fairly quickly for your vertical bust darts. Now, if you're working bottom up and you've added all of these extra stitches for the bust, after you finish the bust, you've got to figure out you have to get rid of those stitches, because you don't want extra stitches when you get to your shoulders to bind off. You want to have the stitch count that you are supposed to have so you can follow your pattern. So what you'll want to do, depending on how the sweater is constructed, you can bind off extra stitches at the underarm. Whatever extra stitches you added, just keep note of how many there are, bind them off at the underarm, and then do some extra decreases along, if you've got raglan lines or within your yoke, or if it's a set and sleeve, along the sleeve shaping. You just have to do it sweater by sweater, figure out where you can decrease those extra stitches. And we've already talked top-down sweaters. You can cast on extra stitches at the underarm or fit them within your raglan shaping or the yoke, and then you've got them for the bust, and then you would work these vertical bust darts in reverse to get rid of that extra fabric. You would decrease them away at those markers to get rid of the extra stitches. So the whole sweater is not too oversized. That's where these kind of darts really stand out. You don't need them if you're wearing a sweater that's already oversized. It's more if the sweater is fitted and you need to add some extra fabric across the bust, but then you want to get rid of it so the rest of the sweater stays more fitted. So I'll link to that article so you can read more about how to do these vertical bust darts in a sweater, where it's really, she talks about using it for waist shaping, but you can use it to add more for your bust shaping as well. Now last is the biggie, the horizontal bust darts, and this is when you're adding sort of like a wedge of extra fabric in your garment. So if you look at this picture, you can see exactly what a short row bust dart does. Those little X's, that is like the apex of your bust line. Like, you don't want your short rows to start or stop right there, because that's going to look pretty awkward. So you move them out about an inch, and that is where you would either start or stop depending on the direction you're going, and you'd work from your side seam to that placement about an inch out from the apex of your bust, back and forth, making these short rows. So one of the questions I often hear people ask is wondering if they actually need this kind of shaping, because it is a little more involved to figure out. And you don't always need this. And like I said, you can combine different methods to get the stitch count that you need across your bust. And it really depends on the sweater you're knitting, how much of an accommodation you need to make for your bust, and lots of different things. But if you've ever knit a sweater and you notice that the front rides up, if it rides up quite a lot, then you might benefit from this kind of a bust dart. Now you can keep it from riding up by using some of the other methods as well. Vertical bust darts will also work for something like that, especially if it's a more fitted sweater. But sometimes this is a good option to have. I just know it takes more work, but it is worth trying if you need it. Another way you can check is if you're knitting a sweater top down. I like to, if I try them on all the time while I'm knitting them. And if you put it on after you've like gotten to the point where you've divided for the sleeves, maybe knit an inch or so, stop and try it on. And if the sweater, the bottom line, the horizontal line going all the way around where you're working, where your needle, your circular needle is at that point, if everything is horizontal and level, you don't need bust darts. But like in this video, this little clip here where I tried on a sweater, and it's very obvious that the back is lower and the front was like raised up like this. And it was very obvious that I needed bust darts right there. I needed some sort of a shaping, because the goal is to have a level line front and back. If it's riding up when you're just trying it on there, it's definitely going to ride up when the sweater's finished. So in this case, I knew I needed some kind of shaping, and I decided to go with bust darts. Now, of course, if I were knitting like this one, I don't need to add bust darts to this. It's already so oversized. There's no reason to add more fabric. But I like them when I know the sweater is going to be more fitted through the top, and I want to keep it maybe loose at the bottom, but I still want it to be fitted through the bust as well. Then I can knit so it fits very well here, and then use this short row shaping so it still is not negative, not a lot of negative ease at the bust, but it's still very close fitting at the bust, but I've just added some extra fabric there so it's not going to ride up in the front. Now, if you don't want to knit like half a sweater and try it on to test, another thing you can do is get out your tape measure and pick a point at your waist, front and back, like the hem of, not the hem, your pants or something like that. Like just use that as a guide. So you're going to measure from your shoulder down the back to either your waist or whatever point you picked on your body, and write that measurement down. And then you're going to measure from that arm line again, from that shoulder line down your front over your bust down to that same point on the front. And then look at the difference. Like, what is the difference between the front and the back? If it's just a couple of inches, you probably don't need short row bust darts. Because knitted fabric stretches, a couple of inches is not a big deal. You can have a bit of negative ease across the bust and it'll look absolutely fine. There's no reason to be scared of negative ease at the bust point. I don't really want negative ease at my waist or my stomach, but right at the bust, it just makes your sweater look like it fits you. It's not like gonna be, not saying it's skin tight everywhere, but just a bit of negative ease at the bust makes it look fitted, which is not a bad thing, especially when you have a larger size or a larger bust. If you knit it too big, it just looks sloppy sometimes. So it's better to have it fit through the bust with just a bit of negative ease. So back to this anyway. So if you're a couple inches difference in that measurement along the front or compared to the back, then you don't really have to do anything. Let's say you are 4 inches of difference. Then what you could do, first of all, I would subtract 2 inches because of that fabric, that knitted stretch. And then you could say, okay, so a bust dart, a 2-inch bust dart, so you're going to add 2 inches of length, basically working short rows back and forth to get 2 inches of length is what you're doing here. Then that is what you could do. So you want to do that measurement, measure from your shoulder to your waist or your pant line or something like that, and then down the back, and then measure from your shoulder down over your bust to that same point on the front to see what the difference is. And if it's more, then I would say 3 inches is iffy, like, because you can subtract that 2 inches because knitted fabric, you know, it's going to stretch. Then you could work a 1-inch bust dart, or you could work some of these other methods that we talked about. But the bigger the difference, the more likely you're going to want to at least have some bust dart shaping, even if you combine it with other methods. You don't have to just do bust darts, especially if you have a much larger bust. You really don't want to go, I don't think past like 3 inches for extra short row shaping in the front, because then it starts to get noticeable, I think. It's really, you have to test it and find out for yourself. So if you find you have to add more than that, that would be 5 inches total. Say like you've got a 5-inch difference, you're going to subtract 2 inches because knitted fabric's going to stretch, and that means you'd want to work a bust dart that is 3 inches tall. I wouldn't go much past that. I'd say 2 to 3 inches is about all you want for a short row bust dart, because then it's going to start to notice, and you've only got so much space between like your side seam and that bust to work those short rows anyway. So it gets more difficult to hide it. You don't want it to be noticeable that you've got extra short row shaping in the front. So what you would do at that point is to combine it with some of these other methods that we've talked about. You could do vertical shaping, vertical darts, and then do bust darts. You can combine these different methods, add stitches at the underarm, and then do short row shaping as well. Like, you can find different ways to combine stitches if you're talking about a much larger bust. So once you know you need bust darts, the next thing to figure out is where to place them. So if you're working top down, you've knit like the whole top of the sweater, you've divided and the sleeves are on hold, you've cast on stitches at the underarm, you're going to knit for about 2 inches or so, and then you're going to stop and work your bust dart shaping. Or if you want to be more exact, you're going to measure. You want to get from wherever the underarm is to the fullest point of your bust. Put on the bra you think you're going to wear with that sweater and then measure like that area to see. But knitted fabric, like I said, it stretches, so this doesn't have to be super exact. You just want it pretty much in that area though. So about where the fullest point of your bust is, that's when you're going to start this short row shaping, creating that wedge of fabric, which is actually very, very simple. But if you're going to do it bottom up, you're going to work the bottom of your sweater and you're going to stop and do this shaping when you get to your underbust. And it's going to like fill in that space from the underbust to the apex of your bust, to the fullest point. Basically what you're doing is filling in that area where the sweater is going to ride up. You're just going to add a few inches extra just along that front part so it doesn't ride up. That's all you're doing. Now, once you know you want to use these bust darts, like you've measured yourself and you see that you could really stand to have like a couple inches of short row bust darts, then, and you know where you have to start doing them, the next thing to do is figure out how to do them. And that's a big topic all by itself. So I'm going to link to some resources, and there's a fabulous website with a PDF you can download. It's a photo tutorial that walks you through exactly how to take your measurements and then work these darts. And it's really very, very simple. And if you want like a book instead, Big Girl Knits has a great section on the bust dart shaping, and one of the custom knits books does as well. I'll link to that. I can't remember. There's 2 books in this series, but one of them has a good section on short rows. So I'll link to that. There's even some calculators online that will help you figure this out. But what you need to know is your stitch and row gauge, and then how long you want that bust dart to be, whether it's a couple like 2 inches or 3 inches. And then you're going to use your row gauge to figure out how many short row turns you have to do. Then you need to measure your body to make sure you're not placing them in too far. You want to keep them out along the sides. There's a lot that goes into this, but I'm going to link to those resources and they'll really walk you through how to do it. Now, adding bust shaping is a great way to really custom fit a sweater, but if you've chosen the wrong size in the first place, adding bust shaping isn't going to help you. You want to make sure you're choosing the right size for your body shape, and sometimes that means not using your full bust measurement. That's something we explore in this video right here. So click that video right there and we'll talk about how to choose the right size. I'll see you in the next video.